The soft hum of the neighborhood felt like background music to my life. The chirping birds in the mornings, the distant sound of kids playing in the evening, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, it was all too familiar, too ordinary. This was the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen me. The days blended into one another, and though I tried to find solace in my routines, there was a persistent ache, a longing for something more. My husband Alan had been my anchor for nearly 3 decades. He was steady, reliable, and utterly predictable. While I admired his consistency, it also left me yearning for a spark, something unexpected, something thrilling. I would never say this out loud, not even to myself, but I felt like a shadow of who I once was. It was during one of those unremarkable evenings that I noticed him, the boy next door. I had been folding laundry in my bedroom, the faint hum of the dryer from the next room filling the air, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The house next door had been rented out to a college kid just a few months ago, but I'd paid little attention. It was his parents who owned the place, and apparently he'd decided to stay there while finishing school. Standing at the window, I could see him in his room, his lights on, his lean frame silhouetted against the curtain. He wasn't doing anything remarkable, just pacing while on the phone and gesturing animatedly, but there was something about his energy, his youth, that caught my attention. I told myself it was nothing. After all, what was the harm in looking? It wasn't like he could see me through my sheer curtains. I returned to folding the laundry, but the moment lingered, stuck like a piece of thread caught on my sweater. The next evening, it happened again. This time, I was watering the plants by the window. The soft glow of sunset had painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, and I could see him clearly in his room, shirtless, leaning over his desk. The faint glow of his laptop illuminated his face, his jawline sharp, his expression focused, my watering can tipped slightly, spilling onto the windowsill. "Get a grip, Anne," I muttered to myself, quickly wiping up the mess. But my heart betrayed me, fluttering in a way that I hadn't felt in years. It became a pattern. I would glance out my window at the most ordinary times, and there he would be, like some magnetic force pulling my gaze. He wasn't doing anything particularly out of the ordinary, stretching after a jog, leaning against his car with his friends, or scrolling through his phone on the front porch, but he became a fixture in my thoughts. The next evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I left the curtains slightly ajar, just a sliver, enough to let the faint glow of my bedside lamp spill into the night. It wasn't for him, I told myself. It was for me. A harmless indulgence, a way to feel noticed. That night I lingered at the window, pretending to adjust my hair in the reflection. He was there again, sitting on the edge of his bed, scrolling on his phone. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he glanced up. Our eyes didn't meet. His attention quickly shifted back to his screen, but my heart pounded in my chest as if it had. The days carried on, each one laced with this new, intoxicating energy. I found myself paying more attention to how I looked, taking a few extra moments to brush my hair or choose a blouse that complemented my figure. My walks through the neighborhood became less about exercise and more about the possibility of running into him. It happened sooner than I expected. I was trimming the rose bushes in the front yard when I heard the sound of footsteps on the pavement. Looking up, I saw him jogging down the street, his t-shirt clinging to his chest, his breath steady and rhythmic. He slowed as he approached, offering a friendly wave. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and slightly out of breath. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Out for a run?" "Yeah," he said, slowing to a stop. "Trying to stay in shape. Finals are coming up, so I need the stress relief." I smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. I remember those days. College can be overwhelming. "You went to college?" His eyebrows raised slightly, and I couldn't tell if he was surprised or just making conversation. "Of course," I said with a laugh, though it was a long time ago. "Well, you don't look it," he said, flashing a grin that was both innocent and devastatingly charming. The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "Thank you," I said softly, returning to my rose bushes to hide my reaction. "All right, well, have a good day," he said, continuing his jog. I watched him go, my heart pounding, the air around me suddenly feeling warmer. That evening, as I settled into bed, I couldn't stop thinking about our exchange. It was innocent, harmless, but it lit a fire within me. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, something to savor briefly before returning to my routine. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The faint light of dawn peeked through the sheer curtains as I brewed my coffee. My reflection in the kitchen window caught my attention. It was a habit of mine to glance at myself, but now I found myself lingering longer. I smoothed my hair and adjusted the collar of my robe, catching the faintest hint of a smile on my lips. There was a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years, and though I wouldn't dare say it aloud, I knew exactly why. I moved to the living room window, cup in hand, and let my eyes drift to the house next door. His car was still in the driveway, the dew on its windshield glinting in the pale sunlight. He wasn't up yet, not that I expected him to be. College students weren't known for their early mornings, but the sight of his familiar surroundings made me feel grounded. Safe, almost. Later that day, I was in the backyard hanging laundry when I saw him again. He was out on his porch, shirtless, sipping water and leaning back against the railing as though he had all the time in the world. My hands froze mid-motion as I watched him. His body was lean and toned, his skin glowing under the sun. He looked so carefree, a stark contrast to the steady rhythm of my carefully curated life. His eyes flicked in my direction, and I panicked, quickly turning away and pretending to adjust the laundry on the line. My heart raced as I felt his gaze linger. The silence of the moment was deafening. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was just imagining it, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. That evening, my husband Alan came home later than usual. He mumbled something about a late meeting at work as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. I nodded absently, setting the table and pouring him a glass of water. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled, or the flush that hadn't quite faded from my cheeks. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost automatic. "Good," I replied, uneventful. He nodded and picked up his fork, the conversation already forgotten. I watched him for a moment, his head bowed over his plate, his focus entirely on his meal. This was our routine, a quiet, comfortable monotony, It wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. He was there, his blinds slightly parted, his figure barely visible in the dim light. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The air felt heavy, charged, with an unspoken tension. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was standing there, waiting for him to notice me. And then he did. Our eyes didn't quite meet, but there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, when I knew he was looking. My pulse quickened, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The next few days passed in a blur. I found myself looking out the window more often, my heart skipping a beat every time I caught a glimpse of him. I didn't know what I was doing or why, but I couldn't stop myself. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he made me feel, alive, noticed, desirable. One afternoon, I was watering the plants in the front yard when I saw him again. He was sitting on the porch steps, a book in his hands. He looked up as I approached, a small smile playing on his lips. "Reading anything good?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I adjusted the hose. "Just some philosophy for class," he replied, holding up the book. "It's not exactly light reading, but it's interesting." I nodded, stepping closer. I remember those days. I used to love reading, though I don't get much time for it anymore. "You should make time," he said, his tone light but sincere. "You seem like someone who has a lot of interesting thoughts." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "That's kind of you to say." He shrugged, his eyes meeting mine for a moment that felt longer than it should have. "Just being honest." Our conversation was brief, but it left me feeling giddy, like a schoolgirl with a crush. I carried that feeling with me for the rest of the day, replaying his words in my mind as I went about my chores. That evening, Alan came home earlier than expected. He wrapped his arms around me from behind as I stood at the stove, his chin resting on my shoulder. "Smells good," he murmured, planting a kiss on my cheek. I smiled, but it felt forced. His touch, once comforting, now felt like an intrusion. I hated myself for feeling that way, but I couldn't help it. My thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by a presence that wasn't his. After dinner, Alan settled onto the couch with his laptop, typing away at some work emails. I took a glass of wine out to the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The house next door was dark, but I could hear faint music drifting from an open window. I leaned against the railing, sipping my wine and staring at the stars. My mind wandered to the boy next door, to the way he smiled, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke. I told myself it was harmless, just a fleeting infatuation. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. As I stood there lost in thought, the faint creak of a door caught my attention. I looked up to see him stepping onto his porch, his figure illumined by the soft glow of a string of lights. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Just needed some air," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. He nodded, leaning against the railing of his own porch. "It's a nice night for it." We stood there in silence, the space between us, feeling both vast and impossibly small. I didn't know what to say, or if I should say anything at all, but in that moment, words didn't seem necessary. The tension between us was palpable, unspoken but undeniable. I told myself to go back inside, to put an end to whatever this was before it went too far, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The days stretched longer than they should, the hours dragging by as though they knew what I was waiting for. I told myself it was absurd to feel this way, that the flutter in my stomach was nothing more than a passing fascination, a harmless distraction. But every time I glanced at the house next door, every time I caught the faintest glimpse of him, that lie unraveled a little more. It happened one afternoon, a Saturday, when Alan had gone golfing with his coworkers. The house felt too quiet, the stillness oppressive. I busied myself with cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing the counters with more force than necessary, trying to distract myself from the anticipation that had settled deep in my chest. A knock on the door startled me. I set the sponge down, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I moved toward the front entrance. My heart skipped a beat when I opened it and found him standing there, his easy smile disarming me immediately. "Hey," he said, lifting a toolbox slightly. "I noticed your gutter's been sagging. Thought I'd come by and fix it." I blinked, momentarily thrown by his presence. "Oh, you didn't have to do that." He shrugged, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I don't mind. Besides, it looks like it's about to fall off." I hesitated, glancing past him at the yard. It was true, the gutter had been in rough shape for weeks, but Alan always brushed off my suggestions to fix it. "Well, thank you. That's very kind of you." "It's no trouble," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my breath catch. "Got a ladder I can borrow?" I led him to the garage, the tension between us thick and almost tangible. He moved with an easy confidence, the kind that made him seem older than he was. As I handed him the ladder, our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt that I was sure he felt too. "You really didn't have to do this," I said, breaking the silence. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning, and missed the chance to be the neighborhood handyman? No way. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Well, I appreciate it." By the time he finished, the afternoon sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard. He climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans before turning to me. Okay. I said," he said, "I should hold up for a while." "Thank you," I said again, meaning it. "Can I get you a drink? Water? Lemonade?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Lemonade sounds great." I led him inside, suddenly hyper-aware of the space between us, or rather, how little space there was. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the room in a way that was both exhilarating and unsettling. I poured him a glass of lemonade, my hands trembling slightly as I set it on the counter. He leaned against the opposite side, his gaze steady on me. "You have a nice house," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you," I replied, taking a sip of my own drink to steady my nerves. "It's comfortable." "That's a good thing," he said, smiling. "Comfort's underrated." I nodded, the conversation feeling too ordinary for the way my heart was racing. He took a long sip of his lemonade, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "So," he said finally, setting the glass down, "what do you do all day?" The question caught me off guard and I hesitated. "Oh, housework, gardening, the usual." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as though he didn't quite believe me. "That can't be all." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Well, it keeps me busy." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he straightened. "You're wasted on housework." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "You just seem, I don't know, like you should be doing something bigger." The compliment or was it an observation? Made my chest tighten. I looked away, focusing on the lemonade in my hands. Life doesn't always turn out the way we plan. Doesn't mean you can't change it, he said simply. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, and I felt an inexplicable urge to close the distance. But before I could say anything, he picked up his glass and drained the rest of his lemonade. "Thanks for the drink," he said, his tone lighter now. "I should let you get back to your day." "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Thanks again for fixing the gutter." He nodded, his smile lingering as he turned and walked to the door. I followed, my heart pounding as I watched him step onto the porch. He hesitated, his hand on the railing, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. But then he glanced back at me, his eyes meeting mine one last time. "See you around," he said, and then he was gone. I stood in the doorway long after he'd left, the glass of lemonade still in my hand. The house felt too quiet again, the absence of his presence almost deafening. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless moment of kindness. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. That evening, I found myself at the window again. The curtains were drawn, but I peeked through the gap, my breath hitching when I saw him on his porch. He was leaning against the railing, his phone in one hand, a cigarette in the other. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, and for a moment, he looked older, more serious. I knew I should step away, close the curtains, and let the night swallow whatever this was. But I didn't. I stood there, watching him, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. This was a line I hadn't crossed yet, but I could feel myself teetering on the edge, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. The next few days passed in a haze. I went through my routines on autopilot, my thoughts constantly drifting back to him. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless fascination, a momentary distraction from the monotony of my life. But deep down, I knew better. I found myself seeking out reasons to be outside when I knew he might be around. A late afternoon walk to check the mail turned into a slow, deliberate stroll past his driveway. A quick sweep of the porch became a prolonged task, my eyes flickering to his house every few seconds. It was foolish, juvenile even, but I couldn't stop myself. It was during one of those moments that I ran into him again. I was trimming the hedges along the side of the house when I heard the sound of footsteps on the pavement. Looking up, I saw him jogging toward me, his t-shirt damp with sweat, his breathing steady but labored. "Hey," he said, slowing to a stop. "Out here, workin' hard, huh?" I smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, trying to keep the place looking decent. "You're doing a great job," he said, his grin easy and warm. "I don't know how you keep up with it all." "It's not as much as it looks," I said modestly, though his compliment sent a ripple of pride through me. He leaned against the fence, catching his breath. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, have you ever thought about taking a break? Like really taking one?" I tilted my head, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, it just seems like you're always busy with something," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe you should let someone else take care of things for a change." The suggestion was innocent enough, but the way he said it, the way his voice softened, made my breath hitch. "I suppose I could," I said carefully, "but old habits die hard." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he pushed off the fence. "Well, if you ever need help, you know where to find me." I nodded, unable to form a proper response as he jogged away, his back straight, his stride effortless. I stood there for a long time after he disappeared, the hedge clippers dangling from my hand. His words replayed in my mind, each one echoing with a weight I didn't fully understand. That evening, I found myself pacing the living room, my heart restless. Alan was out again, attending some networking event for work, and the house felt suffocatingly empty. I poured myself a glass of wine and went to the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The house next door was dark, and for a moment I felt a pang of disappointment. But then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on gravel. I turned, and there he was, walking up his driveway, a small bag slung over his shoulder. He noticed me immediately, his face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, night owl!" I laughed softly, raising my glass in greeting. "Guilty as charged. Late night?" "Just coming back from a study group," he said, setting his bag down on the porch. "It's not as exciting as it sounds." "I wouldn't know," I said, leaning against the railing. "My late nights are usually spent folding laundry or catching up on emails." "That doesn't sound very exciting either," he teased, his grin widening. I shrugged, smiling despite myself. "It's not, but it's my life." He stepped closer, his hands resting on the railing just a few feet from mine. The proximity sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my heart start to race. "You ever think about doing something different?" he asked, his voice low. "Sometimes," I admitted, my eyes meeting his. "But it's not always that simple." "Doesn't mean it's impossible," he said, his gaze steady. "Sometimes you just have to take a leap." The way he said it, the intensity in his voice, made it feel like he was talking about more than just a hypothetical. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Maybe," I said softly, unsure of what else to say. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but I couldn't find the words. And then, just as I was about to retreat inside, he spoke. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." The statement caught me off guard, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "What do you mean?" He smiled, leaning in just slightly. "You're different. In a good way. You've got this energy about you. It's hard to explain." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "That probably sounded weird." "No," I said, finding my voice. "It didn't. It's just unexpected." He nodded, his smile softening. "I guess I should let you get back to your evening." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. "Good night." "Good night, Anne," he said, his tone warm, familiar. I watched him retreat into his house, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. My hands trembled as I set the wine glass down, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't ignore. This was no longer just a harmless distraction. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't deny. As I climbed into bed that night, I felt a pang of guilt. Alan was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me. I knew I was treading dangerous waters, but the pull was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days blurred into a rhythm I both feared and craved. Every time I stepped outside, my eyes instinctively searched for him. Sometimes it felt harmless, like seeing a neighbor you happened to notice. But other times, like the moments when his gaze lingered on me, it felt anything but innocent. It happened on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Alan had left early that morning for a weekend golf retreat with his colleagues, and the house was quieter than usual. Too quiet. I decided to work in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming overgrown plants, the repetitive motions a futile attempt to quiet my restless thoughts. I was kneeling near the rose bushes when I heard his voice. "Need a hand?" I turned sharply, my heart skipping a beat as I saw him leaning casually against the fence, a small grin playing on his lips. He was dressed in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled as though he'd just come from a nap. The late sunlight framed him, making him look even younger, more untouchable. And yet, he was right there. "Only if you're good at gardening," I said, trying to keep my tone light as I brushed dirt from my hands. He smirked, stepping closer. "I can't promise I'm good at it, but I'm a fast learner." Before I could protest, he climbed over the low fence, landing gracefully in my yard. The space between us suddenly felt impossibly small. He crouched beside me, his hands brushing the edge of the rose bush. "These things look sharp," he said, his grin widening as he looked up at me. "You've got guns." I laughed, trying to ignore the way his proximity made my chest tighten. "It's not that bad. You just have to be careful." "Careful?" he repeated, his voice soft, almost teasing. "I'll keep that in mind." For a while we worked side by side, the silence between us surprisingly comfortable. I showed him how to trim the bushes without damaging the flowers, his hand surprisingly steady for someone who claimed to have no experience. "This isn't so bad," he said after a while, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Kind of relaxing, actually." "See? I told you," I said, smiling despite myself. He looked at me then, his eyes lingering on mine in a way that made my breath catch. "You're good at this." "At what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Making things better," he said simply. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked away, focusing on the roses instead. But I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. "You don't have to do it all, you know," he said softly. I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself. It's okay to let someone else take care of you for a change." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, my pulse quickening. "I should get back," he said suddenly, standing and brushing the dirt from his jeans. "But if you ever need help, you know where to find me." I nodded, my voice failing me as he climbed back over the fence, his footsteps fading into the distance. I sat there for a long time after he left, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. That evening I found myself standing by the window again. The house next door was lit up, the faint sound of music drifting through the air. I could see him through the open blinds, lounging on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked relaxed, completely at ease, and for a moment, I felt an ache I couldn't explain. I told myself to walk away, to focus on something else, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I found myself stepping out onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The glow of the porch light cast a warm halo around me, and I wondered if he could see me from where he sat. As if sensing my thoughts, he looked up. His gaze met mine through the darkness, and for a moment neither of us moved. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised my hand in a small wave, unsure of what else to do. He hesitated, then waved back, his smile faint but unmistakable. The gesture was simple, almost innocent, but it sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. I stood there for a moment longer, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words, before retreating back inside. The next morning, I decided to bake. It was something I hadn't done in ages, but the act of measuring and mixing felt grounding, a way to steady my racing thoughts. I had just pulled the tray of cookies from the oven when the doorbell rang. Wiping my hands on a towel, I made my way to the door, my heart skipping a beat when I saw him standing there, a box in his hands. "Mornin'," he said, his grin easy and warm. "I borrowed this a while ago and figured I should return it." I glanced at the box, one of Alan's old tools, and nodded. "Thank you. I'm sure he'll appreciate it." He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the tray of cookies on the counter. Are those homemade?" I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. They are. Want one?" He didn't need to be asked twice. He followed me into the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter as I set the tray down. "You've been holding out on me," he said, taking a bite of a cookie. "These are amazing." "Glad you like 'em," I said, unable to hide my smile. We talked for a while, the conversation easy and light, but there was an undercurrent, a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. When he finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment, though I couldn't say why. "Thanks for the cookie," he said, his smile lingering. "I'll have to find an excuse to borrow something else soon." I laughed softly, my chest tightening as he stepped out the door. "You're welcome any time." As I watched him walk away, a thought struck me, a realization that sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a distraction anymore. It was a temptation, a pull I didn't know if I could resist. The cookies were just the beginning. Over the following days, I found myself looking for reasons to see him, small excuses that wouldn't feel like excuses if I said them out loud. A forgotten tool, a question about fixing something, even a casual wave from the porch. It all felt like part of an unspoken dance, one I wasn't sure how to stop. And I didn't want to. One quiet evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the twilight casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. The air was still, the kind of stillness that felt charged, as though something was about to happen. I had been staring at the roses for so long that the sudden sound of his footsteps startled me. "Anne?" His voice was soft, tentative, and when I looked up, he was standing at the edge of the yard. "Hi," I said, my heart skipping a beat. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the porch steps. "Of course," I said, moving slightly to make room. He didn't climb all the way up, instead settling on the steps below me, close but not too close. The distance felt deliberate, respectful, but it did nothing to calm the fluttering in my chest. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, leaning back on his elbows. "Just thinking," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "It's been a long day." "Yeah." His eyes flickered to mine, his expression curious. Anything in particular? I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Um, uh, just life, I said vaguely. "Hmm, you ever feel like you're stuck in a routine?" He laughed softly, the sound low and warm. "Oh, all the time. But I guess that's part of growing up, right?" "Maybe," I said, looking down at him. "But I think it's more than that." He tilted his head, studying me. "What do you mean?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain the restlessness that had taken root inside me, the longing for something I couldn't name? Instead, I shook my head, offering a small smile. "It's nothing," I said, taking a sip of my wine. He didn't press me, but I could feel his gaze lingering. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to speak, to close the distance, but the weight of reality held me back. "I should probably get back," he said after a while, his voice soft. "Thanks for letting me crash your quiet time." "Any time," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and for a moment he hesitated. His eyes met mine, and I felt the air shift, the tension crackling like a live wire. I thought he might say something, but instead he offered a faint smile and walked away. I sat there long after he was gone, the wine in my glass untouched. The stillness of the night pressed against me, and I felt the weight of my choices, both the ones I had made and the ones I hadn't. The next morning, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Alan returned from his trip earlier than expected, his presence a sharp contrast to the quiet solitude I'd grown used to. He moved around the house with practiced ease, his focus on his phone as he answered emails and made calls. It was as though he hadn't even noticed the change in me, the crack in the foundation of our marriage. "Everything okay?" he asked over dinner, his tone casual. "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" He nodded, his attention already shifting back to his phone. I watched him for a moment, the familiarity of his presence both comforting and suffocating. He was a good man, steady and reliable, but I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us, the gap that no amount of small talk could bridge. It wasn't until I heard the faint knock on the door that my heart stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. When I opened it, he was standing there, his expression hesitant but determined. "Hi," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I asked, glancing nervously over my shoulder. Alan was upstairs, the faint sound of the television filtering down the hall. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. I needed to see you." My pulse quickened, and I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me. The porch light cast a warm glow over his face, and I felt my resolve slipping. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but I couldn't stay away." His words sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The world around us seemed to fade, the only sound the pounding of my heart. "This has to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can," he said, simply. "You should go," I said finally, my voice firm. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he nodded. "Good night, Anne." "Good night," I said, my voice breaking. I watched him walk away, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. When I stepped back inside, the house felt impossibly quiet, the echo of his presence lingering in the air. That night, as I lay in bed beside Alan, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, the choices I had made, the lines I had crossed. They all came crashing down around me. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, that something had to give. But the thought of letting go, of returning to the life I had known before, felt impossible. And as I drifted off to sleep, the weight of my guilt and longing pressed down on me, a reminder that some lines, once crossed, could never truly be undone.